We are live.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Let's Talk About Protecting Trees on Private Property Town Hall. We're pleased to welcome all of the attendees tonight who are here with us in person, who are participating virtually, and who are watching on the live stream. This live stream is being recorded and can be watched on the City of Brantford's YouTube channel live right now or any time following tonight's meeting. Thank you for your interest in the private tree protection bylaw, and thank you everyone who submitted surveys so far, who sent us questions and have provided comments on our Let's Talk page, and to everybody who's come to our in-person ward open houses. My name is Laura Almeida, and I am the Policy and Program Support Analyst for the City's Public Works Commission. I have been working closely with a team comprised of forestry, planning, bylaw, legal, and economic development staff to investigate some potential expansions to the city's existing private tree bylaw. Before we begin, I will outline some housekeeping items to keep our town hall running smoothly. We ask that all questions be held until the end of the presentation. The question and answer period will be moderated, and our moderator will cue participants from both the in-person audiences and the virtual audience who express an interest in asking a question or sharing feedback. We ask that those who are joining us online keep their microphone on mute and to keep it on mute until they are invited to speak by the moderator. And we also ask that folks who have joined us virtually keep their cameras off and until they are speaking. So the purpose of this town hall is to present some information about potential expansions to the city's private tree bylaw, including the initial background research that we conducted, the state of the private tree bylaws that are being run in other municipalities, and where we are currently at with the community engagement campaign that we're running right now. This town hall is also an opportunity for community members to provide additional feedback and to ask us some more questions. So following the presentation, we will open up the floor for those further questions and feedback, and we will be happy to address any concerns you might want to share with us today. So now I'll jump into the slideshow and begin the presentation. So throughout this presentation, I will be providing an overview of the need for an enhanced private tree bylaw, including information about Brantford's local tree canopy and how other municipalities are working to protect and enhance their tree canopies. I will then provide a summary of the feedback that we've received so far, inclusive of whether or not the city should be enhancing our private tree bylaw, and if so, to what extent. I will then share the next steps for the project after the conclusion of this round of public engagement. So just kind of a general description of what a private tree bylaw is. It is a regulation intended to add checks and balances to activities on private properties that will result in the removal or injury of a healthy, non-hazardous, and non-invasive tree. It is one tool that municipalities can use to protect and enhance local tree canopy for the purpose of building a more sustainable and resilient community. The City of Brantford already does have a private tree bylaw that regulates the protection of trees on a small percentage of private properties, but I will get into some of the gaps and problems with this current bylaw shortly. I also wanted to remind everybody that the city does have a bylaw regulating the protection of trees on city property, and that this bylaw was recently updated on May of this year, just to make those protections a little bit more enforceable. So right now, under the city tree protection bylaw, no one can just take down a tree on city property, and that includes like trees on boulevards. As for why we are pursuing an enhanced private tree bylaw, we are doing this mainly to mitigate the effects of climate change as we're experiencing them in our local urban environment. So we really want to protect that neighborhood level tree canopy and ensure more trees aren't coming down than are being planted or replanted. We want to protect those larger established trees that sequester the most carbon. We also know that it can take between 10 and 30 years for trees to reach their full maturity and sequester the most carbon. We also know that trees are crucial climate change mitigation assets that help manage stormwater flooding, they help cool ground temperatures, and they provide many other benefits, shade coverage, so many other benefits. We also want to advance the city's official plan, which includes a target for a 40% tree canopy by 2051. It is important to note that the Brantford's community and community climate change action plans emphasize the need for tree preservation through both education and enforcement, and bylaws fall under the enforcement side of those. The goals we hope to achieve through this enhanced bylaw include preventing tree removals prior to the approval of development applications, discouraging the unnecessary removal of healthy, non-hazardous, and non-invasive trees, and encouraging a culture of tree preservation as the community grows and develops. We also want to preserve the unique character of neighborhoods, and that includes their natural infrastructure. Regarding where exactly we are in the project timeline, we are currently nearing what could be considered the halfway point, as identified by the star that says we are here. We are currently in the middle of our community and stakeholder engagement period, which we officially launched on October 4th of this year. Prior to launching this community engagement campaign, we conducted extensive background research, which included engaging with our comparator municipalities across Ontario on the successes and challenges that they've experienced with their private tree bylaws. Our city project team was also formed in late spring or early summer of 2023. And this is the team that will be collaboratively drafting the potential bylaw options that we will be reviewing with City Council for their consideration. Our plan currently is to bring those draft options in front of City Council by Q2 of 2024. So that would be sometime in the early to late spring. Should a draft be approved by Council, the intention would be to have it come into effect by the end of Q2 2024, following a lot of community education. And then that would only come into effect if Council approves the bylaw. So we are looking into an enhanced private tree bylaw because the city's existing private tree bylaw only protects trees on identified woodlots, wetlands, and areas of natural interest. While these protections are important, the lack of applications to other private properties creates conditions where property owners have been clear-cutting large numbers of trees without the city's knowledge or ability to require any replanting. And this has started to become a problem on private properties that are undergoing development. This is why it's really important that an enhanced private tree bylaw be pursued as the city continues to grow and develop. We really need to ensure that this growth and development is pursued sustainably and not at the expense of the natural environment or future generations. So let's talk a little bit more about Brantford's tree canopy. So in fall of 2022, an aerial LiDAR study was conducted to quantify the city's tree canopy coverage. A LiDAR study is essentially a measurement of the ground coverage provided by all of the trees within city boundaries taken from a bird's eye view. And it found that the city's overall tree canopy is 21.5%, and that represents over 650,000 trees. This tree canopy varies by ward, so it's 18% in Ward 4 and up to 25% in Ward 1. And of the city's total tree canopy, only 18% of these trees are located on city-owned and managed properties. 74% are located on private properties, and that represents over 500,000 trees. And I will post all of these slides online on our Let's Talk page after the presentation if anyone wants a closer look at this map. So we have received a few questions regarding why so much of Brantford's tree canopy is located on private property. And just one of the reasons being that there is just more private property within city limits than there is city property that's plantable. In response to similar concerns regarding in response to similar concerns regarding tree canopy loss, other municipalities across Ontario have developed and implemented private tree bylaws with varying coverage. As you can see, Brantford's current tree bylaw aligns with those of Brant County, Pickering, Kingston, and Niagara, in that it only covers private properties in designated environmental areas. There are other municipalities such as Barrie, Orillia, Kitchener, and Guelph, whose bylaws cover private properties only when they are a certain property size, and this has ranged from half an acre to 1.25 acres. But the most common bylaw coverage currently is a bylaw that covers all private properties regardless of property size and trees once they have reached a defined size. And the defined size ranges from municipalities from as small as 10 centimeters at DBH all the way up to 50 centimeters at DBH. And DBH stands for diameter at breast height. There are still a few municipalities who don't really have any private tree bylaws at all. Hamilton, Windsor, Chatham, Kent are just a couple of them. So to protect the 74% of Brantford's tree canopy located on private property, a potential option that we're exploring is to expand the coverage of the private tree bylaw to include all properties regardless of size and all healthy, non-hazardous, and non-invasive trees measuring above 20 centimeters at DBH. This expanded coverage would align with the bylaws of Burlington, Oakville, Peterborough, Cambridge, London, and Brampton. It would allow the city to account for and discourage the removal of healthy, non-hazardous, and non-invasive trees unless an accompanying arborist report recommended it, or a tree replacement plan was put in place with the city. While this option for bylaw coverage is the option that we've been soliciting your feedback on, there are still other options that we are looking into. Some examples of other options include an expanded bylaw that covers private properties once the property has reached a defined size, so half an acre, etc. Or we've also been pondering the idea of expanding a bylaw to only include properties undergoing active development. So they would have like an active development application with the city. There's a wide range of options that we can still pursue. But while those alternative options are in line with what some municipalities have pursued and will address one source of tree canopy loss locally, neither will be able to prevent neighborhood level tree canopy loss over time. And this is especially important for Ward 4. The tree canopy coverage in Ward 4 is only 18%. In Wards 3 and 5, it is 20%. And all three of those wards have lower tree canopies than the citywide average. So under the specific scenario of a private tree bylaw that covers all properties regardless of size and trees once they've reached 20 centimeters at DBH, if a property owner wanted to remove a tree larger than this, they would basically just apply for a permit. They would do this by either contacting the planning and development team if the property was part of an active development application, or they would contact forestry and horticulture for standalone tree removal that isn't tied to any existing applications. Just for transparency, we also wanted to share the average costs of permitting processes as we've seen in other municipalities. Some municipalities do charge an application fee, and the most common one I've seen is about $50. Most municipalities with those more expansive tree bylaws, they require that an arborist report be submitted to verify the condition of the tree that is being requested in the permit. And most of these municipalities also require a tree replacement plan that includes at least one replacement tree for every healthy, non-hazardous, and non-invasive tree approved for removal. Should the city pursue a permit process involving the collection of any fees would be used for the sole purpose of administering the bylaw, as well as funding replacement tree planting that would be planted on city property. So we want to make it very clear that under this bylaw, residents would still be able to remove any trees that are dead, dying, diseased, infested, invasive, or presenting a hazard without waiting for permit approval if they were to submit an arborist report within a defined time, 48 to 74 hours of tree removal, which attests to the condition of the tree and recommends its timely removal. Under these conditions, the property owner would not be in contravention of the bylaw and would be exempt from any tree replanting requirements. So this whole bylaw, the intention is to not discourage the removal of trees that should be removed for safety and environmental health reasons. An important question we received from both the online surveys and in-person ward open houses was why an arborist report would be necessary for implementing this bylaw. Our response to that is that we believe that arborist reports would be essential for identifying the tree's species, size, and distinguishing it from lookalikes. We've noticed that the invasive tree of heaven looks similar to the native black walnut. Assessing trees' health, including any signs of disease, infestation, or structural damage. Certified arborists can also provide risk assessments for trees, for any risks that the tree may pose to surrounding people or property. And most importantly, the arborist would be able to make a evidence-based recommendation for what the tree needs, including any maintenance activities that would address concerns with the tree, or if necessary, recommend the removal of the tree. As previously stated, trees that are dead, dying, diseased, etc., will be exempt from any tree replacement requirements. All right, so let's talk about what we've heard so far from the community engagement campaign. So like I said before, we launched this campaign back in October, and it included online resources on Let's Talk at Brantford.ca, where residents could learn more about Brantford's tree canopy and the need for tree protection measures. They could ask the project team questions, provide feedback through an online survey, etc. We also held in-person open houses at community centers in each of the city's 5 wards. So residents could come and discuss the proposed bylaw enhancements with members of the project team. We've also distributed some printed resources, including the surveys and tree canopy fact sheets that are just at the back over there. We've distributed them to community centers through the neighborhood associations and through our open houses. So far, we've received just under 200 completed surveys. We've had 181 online surveys submitted, and then 9 have been handed to me in person. And from these surveys we received, 91.7% of respondents identified themselves as local residents who owned property. 8.3% identified themselves as local residents who do not own property. 6.1% identified themselves as a local business owner, and 0.6% represented themselves as a local developer. Of these respondents, when it came to the question of whether or not the private tree bylaw should apply to all properties regardless of property size, 49.7% of residents responded that it should, 42% of respondents disagreed, and 8.3% were neutral. When it came to whether or not the private tree bylaw should apply to trees once they have reached a certain size, the example we provided was 20 centimeters at DBH. 44.8% of residents agreed that it should, 43.1% of residents disagreed, and 12.2% were neutral. In addition to asking whether respondents agreed or disagreed on the presented scenario of an expanded private tree bylaw, we also asked for the reasoning behind their agreement or disagreement. These rationales could be summarized into 3 distinct categories, the first being agree, the second agree, but only under certain conditions, and the third being disagree. For respondents that agreed, the reasons provided covered the importance of a larger tree canopy to help mitigate the local effects of climate change, the need to prevent both large-scale and incremental neighborhood tree canopy loss, and the need to protect natural assets that contribute to the health of our community. For respondents that agreed, but only under certain conditions, the reasons they provided were the need to balance environmental protections with the potential impact on the ability of a property owner to maintain their property. They mentioned that the bylaw should not apply to tree maintenance activities and that trees within a certain proximity to an occupied building should be exempt from the bylaw, and that the cost and timelines of permits shouldn't needlessly hinder responsible tree removal, and that this bylaw, if implemented, should focus on protecting larger trees. For respondents that disagreed, the reasons provided covered the importance of maintaining the private property owner's autonomy over what they can do with their properties, concerns over the potential costs of permits, arborist reports, and tree replacement requirements, and concerns over the timelines associated with having to apply for and wait for a permit to conduct regular property maintenance activities. Before we end the formal presentation and get into the Q&A, we wanted to address some concerns that we've received throughout our community engagement campaign. So one concern is that the bylaw will prevent the removal of dead, dying, and dangerous trees. So we really want to emphasize that these trees would be exempt from any tree replacement requirements. The property owner would just need to submit an arborist report within a certain amount of time to attest that the tree being removed was in fact dead or dying. Another concern was that this bylaw will discourage residents from planting trees in the first place. This bylaw will focus on preserving existing trees wherever possible and will not completely prohibit the removal of trees. It would require that property owners work with the city to determine if there are any suitable alternatives to tree removal, but if not, ensure that replacement trees are being planted. We also received feedback that emphasized that this bylaw would prevent property owners from enjoying their property. And in response, we just want to state that this bylaw is one of the tools that can be used to ensure that private property modifications are being done in a way that is sustainable and that does not adversely impact the surrounding neighborhood. And the last concern I wanted to address ahead of time was that the approach being discussed for this bylaw, specifically the property size and tree coverage, there are some folks who believe that this is already set in stone and that any feedback received will not impact the final outcome. And I just wanted to assure everybody that this is not true and that the draft of the bylaw that will be brought before council next year is being informed by the feedback received through this community engagement campaign. Nothing is set in stone, and we are still investigating a variety of options for this bylaw. All right, so what our next steps are. So following this town hall, we will be meeting with all of the ward councillors individually to review this information in depth and get their feedback on the coverage of this expanded bylaw. We will continue to engage with local stakeholders for the duration of this project, and we will continue to take public feedback. Our goal is to present formally drafted options to City Council at a committee of the whole meeting operations before the end of Q2 2024. And if you are interested in reviewing the project information after this meeting, you can visit letstalk@brantford.ca/trees. The online survey will still be available there as well. You can also reach out to the city's customer contact center if you have any further questions about the tree bylaws, tree planting and maintenance, etc. The contact center will be able to direct you to the most appropriate staff person based on your question. So we will now dedicate the remainder of tonight's session to answering your questions and hearing your feedback. So I'll hand it over to my colleague, Maria Visacki, to facilitate the Q&A portion of this meeting.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks very much for your detailed and very comprehensive presentation. As Laura said, my name is Maria Visacki. I'm the city's Director of Communications, Community Engagement, and Customer Service. I want to thank everybody who has joined us tonight, both in person and the 10 participants who have joined us virtually online for tonight's town hall about this important community project. So as Laura said, we're going to use the remaining time in tonight's session to address questions and comments from the audience, both in person and virtually. And we're going to take turns going from the folks that are in the room to those who are attending online. So if you do have a comment or a question that you want to be part of the public record and to help inform staff and council when they consider this item, by all means, I invite you to come up to the delegates table here. I'm going to ask you to use the microphone just so that those people that are watching from home can hear what's being said and what's being asked. So is there anybody who would like to make a comment or ask a question? Okay, come on up. And I'll just ask you to say your name and what neighborhood, where you live. You just have to press the button. Oh, okay, there you go. He turned it on for you.
Hi, my name is Gwen Chapman. This is not the first time here. I am part of the Brantford Butterfly Way project, and I'll get this thing on the go because I don't know if anybody else is ready for this. Our group has discussed this. I've been to 2 of the town meetings, and there is some good and some bad that we see happening with this bylaw. First of all, the cost to replace a tree is not $500. We can go and buy trees at the nursery, like what we can do for less than that. I think our main concern, or my main concern, is the fact that no matter how many trees you take down, you cannot replace the old growth that is currently there. This project needed to be started years and years and years ago, replacing trees. So, for example, the old growth oak trees in Mohawk Park are very old growth oak trees. When they start dying, no matter how many little seedling or how many saplings you put in there, it is never going to replace the current old growth. So starting the tree planting to replace old growth or future old growth probably should have started 20, 25 years ago. Places like, and I hate to bring this up, but I said I would, places like the old Arrowdale property / Arrowdale property, whatever. There are a lot of trees on that property that are going to be come in, that are going to be clear cut and knocked down and taken out for residential homes. There are protected Kentucky coffee trees on that property that citizens are concerned about. And, you know, they just want to know what's happening and what is the developer's responsibility going to be in replacing what they take down, whether it be, you know, current development, past development, future development. They need to be responsible. You can't be tearing down acres and acres of full growth forests like over by Oak Park Road and not having any responsibility to replace that. So my other, I guess for me, is the concern of what trees are going to be taken down on private property for what reasons. So if people want to take down trees because they don't want to rake the leaves or they don't want to have leaves in their pool, that's not a reason to take a tree down. And it is a home. That tree is a home to, especially like oak trees, home to pollinators, home to birds. And if we don't look after our pollinators and our birds and our bats and everything else, who is going to look after them, right? We need to protect the trees that are currently there and make sure that we plant more native trees. I'm not sure where the city is planting all these trees that they say they're planting, but I certainly don't see it myself. So my concern is, you know, yes, there needs to be maybe a property standard where the tree is dead and dying, but to ask the citizens to plant a tree, if they don't put it on their property, to pay $500 to plant a tree on the city, in the city property, that's, to me, that's a little much. And I think the city as a whole needs to set by example. So if they set by example, like putting in the microforest down in Homedale, then that's great. Do more of that as opposed to creating a big fuss with private bylaw. I know it sounds kind of wonky, but you know, we're just looking out for the pollinators and the birds and everything else. So city needs to set by example.
Thanks, Gwen. Did you want staff to try to address some of the questions that you raised? I should have mentioned that on the side here, there are a number of very competent colleagues of mine from Parks and Recreation and Forestry and other public works divisions, engineering, development engineering is here. So I will ask any of them if they want to address anything that you raised.
Sure. What are you saying? I've talked to a few of you guys, and you know how I feel, and you know how the group feels and our concerns, and our, you know, because we want native trees. We don't want, you know, non-native trees planted. And we are concerned about the coverage, the old growth and tearing down the trees. So the trees that were just taken down at Waterworks Park were old growth trees. And they're being replaced by saplings. And they're not the same. It's not the same. The trees that were just taken down at Waterworks Park for the parking lot were homes to birds, animals, insects, and now they're gone. So the saplings will take years and years and years to get to be that again. So please stop paving paradise and putting in parking lots. Is all I can say. So I don't know. I don't really have any questions. For those that I've spoken to, you know, because I've spoken to you. So I just hope that this does, whatever you guys do, you do the right thing for the majority. And you know, save the pollinators and stuff. That's all I have.
Thanks, Gwen. I saw them furiously making notes. Okay, we're going to go online next. We got a number of speakers with raised hands. So Heather Beckwith, I'm going to start with you.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
How you all doing today? So I did listen to the presentation. Now, I do understand the environmental effects of tree planting. One of my biggest concerns is, as a property owner, is trees on private property. And that being said, trees that are planted close to property lines that have just kind of gotten away. In the past, there has been, you know, I've called the city regarding trees that overhang over our property line. And in some municipalities, I know that if it hangs over your property line, then you can cut off the limbs to, you know, if that's what you want. But that's not the case here in Brantford. To my understanding, it doesn't matter if a tree grows and hangs right over your property, then that's the way it goes. And as long as the tree is quote unquote healthy. But that being said, healthy trees come down in storms all the time. And when it's fairly close, or it could come onto my bedroom, I'm wondering how, like, seeing as the properties and backyards and such are not huge, and if such a big tree is in the backyard, shouldn't private property owners have the ability to protect themselves from injury? Or do you understand what I'm trying to say here?
Yes, we definitely do. That's something that I will look into and post on our Let's Talk page, was what property owners can do if there are limbs hanging over into their private property from another property's tree. I will look for that information and I will post that on our Let's Talk to respond.
I've actually called the city and talked to people over the last several years. It's not a concern right now. It has been in the past. But the answer I've repeatedly gotten is, too bad. There's nothing you can do about it. If the tree overhangs your property, that tree's been there for a long time, and the trees, you can't depict how a tree grows. So it has been made very clear that there was nothing anybody, like, I could do about that, regardless of if the tree's limbs were hanging over my garage. I'm not the owner of the tree, so there was nothing I could do about it. I could just pray that a lightning storm wasn't going to snap it.
In other municipalities, like, those are considered civil matters as well. But what I have seen on other municipal websites is they do say that residents, if a tree is hanging over onto your property, that the resident on that property it's hanging into can trim those limbs hanging onto their property. But I don't know if that's the case in Brantford, but I will check into that. I think we've got Ben from Bylaw here, who might be able to provide some information right now, actually.
That would be great because as far as I was made aware, that we actually had taken down 2 trees about 7 or 8 years ago to put in a pool, and we were wanting to take down some of the overhanging limbs, and that was not permitted. Like, we had with their permission, the neighbor's permission, yeah, we could do that, no problem. But if they didn't want them taken off, regardless of if they hang over our property or not, it was a no. Like, we didn't have any right. So, yeah, I mean, if he could get back to us within the meeting, that would be fantastic.
Good evening. My name is Ben Spicer. I'm the supervisor of bylaw compliance. Just to kind of address the private trees overhanging fences. So unfortunately, unless through the property standards bylaw, we only require trees to be trimmed if they're dying, diseased or decayed, or there's damages. So when there's a tree limb overhanging a fence, that's technically a civil matter. You can technically trim it if you desire, but keep in mind you might be opening yourself to civil liability if that tree does die, because you can only remove up to 25% of the crown of the tree. It might take a few years, but that tree will end up dying. So we always kind of encourage people to talk to their neighbors, try to resolve these themselves privately.
Right. So basically, if I'm understanding what you just said correctly, is you can, but you can also be sued for it, and that a private citizen doesn't really have any say over what overhangs their property in the regard to tree limbs and such.
At this time, yeah, that's correct. You open yourself up to civil liability if that tree does die. There's also, if the tree limb does fall and damages the fence or damages your property, I would always recommend making that insurance claim, because that is damages caused by that as well.
Right, and that is for the tree's property. Who would be responsible for that would be where the tree, for lack of a better word, lives. So would live on a neighbor's property if their tree was to have fallen down and damaged. But I guess it's more of a, it's not even just a fence. When it overhangs your house, that definitely would pose a concern. So that part of this, I don't even know if that could be taken into consideration and revamped at this time with since we're talking about trees and what have you in the Brantford area, if that could be one thing that could be looked at and kind of tweaking that a little bit as to give people rights.
That's something we'll take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman in the back, want to come on?
First, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you to all the city people here and also all the residents who came out, but most importantly to all the people who are working hard on drafting this bylaw. You know, being here late at night and working, I just want to say thank you, and I think this is something really important. I think that I just want to say that I think when considering this bylaw, I think it's so important, and there's going to be a lot of people who are against it for various reasons. I think regarding the permitting process for removing trees, it may be nice for there to be different considerations. Maybe if it's like talking about the size of the property, like maybe having like a sliding scale. So if you're removing more properties, like maybe it's, or sorry, if you're removing more trees, maybe it's costs more or maybe it costs less. So maybe like a different procedure for residential versus commercial properties, as residential owners may not have access or like the know-how for going about an arborist report. So there wasn't really any question there, but I just wanted to say a couple things. And I just wanted to also say about regarding DBH that I think we're talking about large trees and the importance of protecting large trees, but how do you get a large tree? It has to be a small tree. It has to start as a small tree. And I think that having that DBH as small as possible, so 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters. I think 20 centimeters is too high. I think it needs to be small and apply to more trees. Thank you. Unless there's anything you wanted to say back. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We're going to go back online to Councillor Martin, who's been waiting patiently.
Yes, thank you. There's a few things. First of all, I have a question about the 40% target for the tree canopy. I know a number of municipalities have realized that that's probably not doable. And given the percentage in a lot of the cities that you showed on your chart, no one is anywhere near 40%. Is that something that's going to be looked at and adjusted downward?
Thank you very much for the question, Councillor Martin. That target is one that we have certainly internally talked about revisiting. It's a target that we have established with council through various reports. So it would need to come back and be adjusted through consultation with council. So if the note that I'm hearing is that that's something that you feel should be readdressed, we will take that one away. The master plan that we're developing through our tree inventory process will help us identify what is more, if there is a different target, what the options are, and how we can have a better strategy of getting there without involving private land for tree canopy preservation. There is no possible way for us to achieve 40%. So that's why this bylaw is so important. But we do need to understand what is possible within the footprint of the city without constraining development too much and balancing that need for canopy growth and canopy support with practical realities. We can't plant trees in the middle of streets to achieve canopy cover, but we do need to try and make the number bigger than it is. 40% may not be the right target.
Yeah, because by the time you look at the city and you take out roads and sports fields, golf courses, buildings, there just isn't enough room to achieve the 40% canopy. You talked about people clear cutting development lots before the developer either puts an application in or even buys the property. And I know someone who experienced this. They were selling a fairly large property, and the developer asked them to cut down a bunch of trees before the closing date, because if they were there when he went with an application, he'd be forced to replace them 3 for 1. So I think part of the problem is our requirement of requiring replacement of 3 for 1 encourages people to take down trees before they come forward with their application. It also discourages people from planting trees on land that has potential for development in the future. So I'm wondering, has anybody thought about changing the 3 for 1 requirement with the idea that hopefully we'll get some trees planted on sites that will be developed in the future, but they may end up coming down again, but maybe not. It's hard to say.
Thanks for the question, Councillor Martin. Gary Peever here. I'm the manager of development engineering. It's a good question with the ratio. It's something we are really looking at quite in depth when it comes to development sites, among others. We are trying to find that balance of, if an old growth tree has to come down, is 3 to 1 enough? Should it be 10 to 1 for that particular tree? Or are other trees count towards that ratio? So it is something we are trying to balance and establish through the bylaw. That's why it's important to get this bylaw right for us. It gives us a tool. It's a tool we don't have against some of the development groups now. And with that, when it happens before development, it allows the other forestry department and us to recognize that and either set a fine on that for doing so, or other ways. So without this bylaw being updated and really kind of looked at, we don't get those tools to use. One of the other kind of components to it as well is, finding those open spaces through the development and land plans of subdivision, finding those buffering areas where we can plant more trees, and create new forests. It is something the city has started to do. There are various locations in the Shellard Lane area that will be developed into a new forest. They haven't yet, but they are set aside for new plantation of trees where future development will not occur. So again, this bylaw really is that tool that we are looking to have so we can better manage and better have expectations of developers when they move forward.
Yeah. Okay, one other thing, somebody commented about all the trees on the former Airedale Golf Course. If you look at Google Maps, Google Earth, and compare the former golf course to the neighborhood around it, you'll see that it's pretty much the same amount of trees. Because with a golf course, you can't put trees on the fairway. Most of the trees there are along the perimeter, especially the north perimeter. And depending on and a lot of them are in the area that will be part of the park. And as for the developer, it's any trees that they can save. They tend to try to save trees because it enhances the property if there's mature trees on the property. One of the things you talk about old growth trees. Do you take into consideration that they might be near end of life? It's like anything that lives, everything dies, so.
Right, so Rick Cox, Director of Parks and Recreation. Councilor Martin, you're right that there is a calculation or part of the analysis on tree removals is health related and age based. So there are trees that are coming close to what seems to be close to the end of their life that may be removed because that is not too far away. I can tell you that our forestry team is one that keeps trees wherever possible within our city properties. We don't like taking down trees, so we want to keep them as long as possible and get the benefits to pollinators and habitat and in the environment for as long as possible. But there comes a point where that risk of a catastrophic failure or a safety issue becomes means that it's time to come down. Some of the trees, the reference earlier to the Waterworks Park trees, some of those trees were not in great shape. They were perhaps quite old, but they were not in great shape. And so the aspiration for the new trees we plant will be that they will last for a long time once they get to a more mature state. So we do take into account the age, the remaining age estimated that we think about, that we think will be there for the trees when we're calculating whether it should come down and when it should come down.
Okay. And for those people who are concerned that this is a done deal, I can assure you that it's not. I don't think I can support this when it comes to council. Certainly not in the format it is now, but if there's some changes made, I'll have to consider those. But I believe that what a private property owner does on their own private property is their business, and the city should not be dictating which trees they can keep and can't keep. And some of the requirements for arborist report, I think, are over the top, and I won't be supporting it. So it's definitely not a done deal. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Counselor. Got a few people in the room. The lady in the pink-ish jacket, you had your, you. I might be a little colorblind, but you come on up.
Good evening. I have a number of points actually, and I agree with the young gentleman who spoke earlier about, I think the city is confusing some things about the bylaw. I think there should be like separate requirements for the development issues, the commercial issues versus your typical average citizen who has a small backyard. And I say that as somebody who's lived in our home for over 30 years. And we currently have 12 trees in our backyard and 5 in the front. And I think that's probably a little bit more than the average when you're talking about Ward 4 not having a great canopy. And we've certainly had the occasion to remove some of those trees because of damage from ice storms, for example, particularly with cedar trees. So the whole idea of a 20-year-old cedar that's sustained irreparable damage in an ice storm. Am I having to pay for an arborist report to remove that kind of a tree? It's over the top. Like, obviously, if we have that kind of investment in our homes and in our properties, extraneous fees for no reason are just not sensible. And I think that brings me to the other point is, you know, rather it being such an intrusive kind of policy for the average homeowner, certainly a bigger spree around education before you put something like this in place for a residential home would be worthwhile. Realistically, what is the average that you want? You know, is 2 trees in a backyard enough? What about if we want to decide that we want to change up the use of some of our space in our backyard and redo a plan? Clearly, we've already done that and you haven't had any complaints from our neighbors or anywhere. Why should I have to have an arborist again to say I want to take out a healthy tree? And many of our trees are fairly small ones, like because you would do that in a typical backyard. But I think there's an intrusiveness to this for property owners that's not well thought through. And I do agree with the lady who was on the phone about the overhanging branches too. Like if somebody's tree is at the end of life, and that does happen for backyard trees, you don't want to pit neighbors against each other in terms of how that can be navigated for over the sense circumstances. Because yeah, you can phone the city, complain about your neighbor and say that their tree is that problem. But that's not the kind of way that we would want to be with any of our neighbors if that were to arise. And I think the whole arborist bit just really, for people who are trying to do their best about their property, that's a whole different thing than if you have a neglected property where the city should step in without a tree policy. So just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks for your feedback. Anybody want to address anything? Okay. We're going to go to Inam. Hopefully I'm saying that right online?
Inam.
Inam. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
No problem. Okay, so let me start by saying that the bylaw that you're proposing is incredible. I'm happy that Brantford is trying to align itself with the rest of the cities. And before I start with my questions, I just want to make a comment to what the councillor had said, that it's an intrusive bylaw, and that we are somehow, or the bylaw is somehow limiting the rights of the private owners. Well, at the end of the day, we share this earth. And there's no such thing that you live in this little bubble above your house and your air is yours, and what you do in this little space does not impact anyone else. Unfortunately, we all share it. So I think it's rather narrow-minded and very selfish to think that that kind of interpretation of rights and private law supersedes or is of higher priority than climate change, which is essentially at the point of not having, humans exist should this pattern continue. So when you think about how important this problem is and what you're using to justify not having it, I just think it's poorly thought through. And I would urge that councillor to rethink what he's proposing in terms of not supporting the bylaw. So that's on that side. One of my questions is that Brantford is growing. Some of the growth is definitely residential, but then there's also business attraction. And it is a manufacturing city, and there's a lot of factories being built. So when we talk about that 40% canopy cover, there's a lot of commuters that are going to be living in Brantford, and that population growth that is being projected over the next 10 years. So does that 40% consider the growth that Brantford is going to go through? Because the pollution is going to increase because some of these factories and manufacturing facilities that we're building, and then also there's the increase in population, the increase in commuters and cars and so on. So is that 40% considering it? Is it enough? Should it be higher?
Just to answer your question, the 40% tree canopy target is quite old. I think it's about 20 years old. I think it was around 2004 when it was developed, and it was a shared target among many municipalities. So no, it does not take that into consideration, the 40% target. It does not.
Okay. All right. So then my next question is, when we recommend that an old tree or a dying tree be replaced, should it be cut down, is it possible to put a limitation on the type of tree that could replace it? There are specific trees that have the highest carbon absorption level, pine trees, evergreen, so on and so forth. And then also to limit or maybe eliminate alien trees. For example, Brampton, in some of their parks, they have Japanese cherry blossoms. I mean, don't get me wrong, it looks beautiful. Maple looks beautiful. But some of these trees are alien trees. And then there are those that are being selected because they look pretty, but they're really not the trees that we want to be planting because they don't have the highest carbon absorption. When they're mature, that is.
Yeah, I can address the first part about, sorry, can you just say the first part again? Sorry, it just left my mind, unfortunately.
Sorry. Okay, so when we recommend that a tree be cut down and there is an arborist report or whatever documentation is required should the bylaw be passed, and that tree obviously is sick and it can be cut down, the replacement tree, are we going to be putting forth suggestions and limitations on the type of trees that can be planted? Mainly because we not only do we want to have the canopy, but we also want to have a canopy that has a maximum carbon absorption. And there are trees that are better at this function than others.
For sure. So when I've looked at other municipalities, some will include an approved species list, and those are often native species of trees. Some just have it as a recommended replacement list, but that's something we're looking into within the bylaw options that we're drafting. And the other question was about the invasive species, correct?
Yes, yes.
So under this bylaw, like part of it is exempting the removal of invasive species of trees. So say if somebody wanted to remove a tree on their property and it was an invasive species, they would be able to do so. We're also looking as the city at number of other initiatives to address invasive species. I'm not quite sure if Rick or anybody from Parks or Forestry wants to speak more about kind of what might be in the future for invasive species.
We'll try that. Sure. We do consider invasive species as in what we're thinking about for the bylaw, that an invasive species would be exempt from the processes and the permits that we're talking about. But in our own work in the trees that we select for what we plant, we have a native species policy. We are trying to emphasize species that are native to the area, and will survive in the environment in which we were planting them. So it might be that it's beside a street, and which is not an easy place for a tree to be. There may be a species that is really good at that has the carbon sequestration that you're looking for, but might not be native to the space, but will do really well in the new environment that we as humans have created. So we're trying to balance the kinds of species that we're planting for survivability, for longevity, for safety, for size that suits the environment that they're going to be in. In terms of limiting the kinds of ornamental trees or tree species that a private land owner might want to put in their own space, I think that's something that the bylaw would have to really carefully consider. We've heard already tonight concerns around, intervention in private property ownership rights, and that's one that, people want to be able to plant in their own space, something that they choose and like to look at. So that's a balancing point that we'll be going to carefully address within the bylaw, but it is important that we educate and encourage and support folks choosing native species that support the pollinators and the species of birds and bees and bugs that live in our area. But I don't know that we will eventually get to the point where we're regulating what someone could plant on their own private property. We can do that on our own space a little bit easier, and we are doing that.
Okay. I just had one more question. As the population grows, there's obviously going to be new developments. And I think Gwen might have touched on this already. When a developer is permitted to cut down either a forest or a portion of a forest, and then also when they're building some of these, 3,000 square foot homes, or, they're larger homes that are on larger lots, the sidewalks or that little patch of grass that is right next to the sidewalk, I believe is technically owned by the city, but the builder really technically just puts one little sapling. So what is the option? Can we potentially have multiple saplings, multiple evergreens? So holding for the builder to replace this forest that they've cut down, or this lot that they're using that used to have X number of trees on them. And they're building this new subdivisions that can have larger homes. So there's definitely space for replacement trees. But what they're doing is they're maintaining that basic one tree, in front of each home. But some of these lots are absolutely massive. And I believe this, the piece of land that is on the other side of the sidewalk is not owned by the private property owner, but it's rather owned by the city. So what is the city doing to plant more trees in these new subdivisions?
Yeah, so I can jump in here, Gary, again, from Development Engineering. This is something we've been looking at over the years with respect to our road allowance width and the zoning bylaw. So I'll start with, the area between a sidewalk and a house could make up both private property and public. Generally, we are trying to achieve at least one tree per new lot and 2 or 3 on corner lots as well. Sometimes that's not achievable because of other items like fire hydrants and such. But we are looking at achieving not only that, and then a replacement value on top of any tree that was cut down for that development. And that could happen in sometimes open spaces or other properties that the city would be obtaining from the developer that are not being built on. It is important to have this bylaw again updated for that ratio. It would help us encourage potentially having trees planted in the rear yards before anyone moves in as well, to make up for that loss of canopy coverage. Secondly, I do want to point kind of everyone to an upcoming public meetings that will be coming in January for the new zoning bylaw. That's an important kind of factor into all of this as well. It talks about how much space does have to be landscape open space. Is there space for a tree to be planted on these private properties, or is it just, a lot of buildings really close together, too close to the sidewalk for a tree to be able to grow? So I do encourage everyone here to provide comments in when that comes for the new zoning bylaw. But it does have a factor of having available space for a tree to properly grow.
Okay. One of the votes that was taken, and correct me if I'm not remembering the numbers correctly, but it seemed to me that those that have voted or participated seem to be in favor of the bylaw. And I don't remember what the statistical, like how big the sample size was. If we get to a point where there are councillors that do sabotage this vote, but you have a sufficient sample size from the residents' response in terms of supporting the bylaw, would you move forward with the bylaw and just sort of negate the sabotaging that could occur from some of the councillors shooting down just because they seem to have some pretty pictures about, pretty thoughts about private property nonsense versus the climate change?
Hi, everybody. Gagan Batra, Manager of Business Support and Sustainability. I'll jump in here. So from the survey feedback, we had just under 200 people complete the survey, and we had approximately 49.7% of the respondents agree. So it's pretty split down the middle, but right now it's leaning towards more people agreeing. And to your question about resident feedback versus counselors' feedback, I would just suggest that, you know, throughout the public engagement process, you really do provide your comments. At the end of the day, the counselors are there to represent the constituents. So please make your opinion heard throughout this process and make sure that they're aware of your advice, feedback, approval, non-approval for any of these items. And that's the way to go, I think, for this.
May I know that counselor, what ward he was in? I just want to make sure he's not in my ward because I'm relatively new to Brantford.
Where do you live?
I live off of Oak Park.
You're good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for your feedback.
You're very welcome.
Okay, in the room here. Sir, if you want to come on up.
Is this live? I'm Bob Cook of Brantford Tree Service. I've operated the tree service for the last 51 years, and I'm still doing the tough stuff. In fact, my family goes back in Brantford for over 100 years. My grandfather was one of the main florists in here for 60 years. My great-grandfather even ran for alderman. I thank for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about the tree bylaw on private property. I wonder if you're aware that it used to be illegal for municipalities to regulate tree cutting on private property. It was believed that regulating tree cutting on private property was an infringement on a homeowner's freedom. However, back when Bob Rae was prime minister, or premier rather, Toronto was having a problem with companies buying up huge chunks of it, ripping it to make it look like an eyesore, and then applying building permits, which the city felt that they had no other choice but issue them. So Bob Rae changed the bylaw for municipalities to regulate tree cutting on private property for that purpose. It was never meant to interfere with individual homeowners. I understand the city is concerned about tree canopy. I wonder how many of you have gone up in the Brantford General Hospital and looked over the city in the summertime. Except for the odd rooftop, you can't find Brantford because of the tree canopy. In fact, as a teenager, my grandparents owned a property or lived on this across from City View Park. And we used to be able to sit on the front porch and watch the cars come down the Burford Highway. Can't do that anymore. I wonder if this is about global warming and the environment. So I would ask the question, what part of our atmosphere is CO2 or carbon as we call it? It doesn't take much time to find the answer. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and only 0.4% carbon. That comes down to 418 parts per million. To simplify it, if you were a millionaire, that would be like losing $418. That is far less than Trudeau spends on a hotel room. Oh, by the way, that 0.04% that is called carbon, only 11% is produced, or 11% of that 4/100th is produced by mankind. That means about $46 in that example. In other words, we're tripping over a very little compared to what our atmosphere is made of. Are you aware that Canada cleans up 10 times the amount of carbon that we produce in Canada? But of course, that's not popular because it wouldn't help the tax end of it. Are you aware that Leamington, they pump CO2s into the greenhouse to increase 30% more growth and tomatoes and cucumbers? Back to about tree bylaw. Some years ago, Brantford implemented one, was to control certain areas of Brantford, especially banks, but also properties that was of an acre size or more. At that time, the person that was put in charge ran it to the extreme. He explained that if he was to fly over Brantford and found an acre of trees, even if there was more than one property, it fell under that ruling. So at that time, I warned Summerhays Crescent about his attitude, and they in turn complained to the city and got him to back it off to make sure it was a perimeter. The ordinary person spends huge amount of time and earnings just to be able to own a home. This home is supposed to be his kingdom. Having things the way they want it, that is subject to the wife's approval, and providing that they're not running a wrecking yard or a house of ill repute. There is many reasons why homeowners take trees down. Some feel unsafe, especially the older ones. Some to reduce the maintenance, some for more sun, some for gardens, some because they want to stay in their home and things are getting beyond them. Some for security, some too close to the house. That's just naming a few. As you know, I've been in the middle of this for many, many years. Such a law would interfere with the homeowner's freedom and privacy, being subject to a city's inspector as to the proper trimming of their tree, its condition, and their trees thereby hindered the homeowner from trimming his own tree, which in turn forces the homeowner to have to hire a cutter. Once again, call a city approval, which could approve or not approve. I will not go any further than that on that. I would like to ask the question, who would be in charge of this bylaw? No, right now, the city doesn't want to be responsible for it, declaring that a tree is safe, because I have been in the middle of that. If you declare a tree is safe, you are responsible for it. Nobody in their right mind would tell you the tree is safe. Some years ago, I heard of Brantford getting into trouble for this very reason. They got themselves in quite a mess. How will this bylaw operate? Will there be trees that the city declares safe and refuse to allow them, the homeowners, to take them down? In that case, the city should be responsible for the total care, whether it's raking the leaves every year, trimming it at their own expense, not the homeowners. And what about the trees that fall over, say, in the neighbor's property, but doesn't do any damage? Are you aware that most insurance companies will not cover if there's no damage? Therefore, whoever property it falls on is left to them to do the cleanup. I had a job where I had to bring a crane in off a house, and since no damage was done, the homeowner had to pay the whole shot. Are you going to be responsible for that too? How about the ones with the deductible? That does damage? Is the city going to be responsible for that? Or is all this going to be turned over to us, one or more tree services, which in turn become more hardship on the house owner and can become a money grab? And what person is really going to tell you any tree is safe? I know from experience, when a magnificent tree, we trimmed around it to preserve this tree, and a month later, it was a gorgeous tree, old growth, gorgeous tree. There was no indication anything was wrong with it. And over it came, roots and all. Took us 2 days to clean it up. So you can imagine how big it was. I think I may have a different idea instead. Make the tree law cover only major construction sites as 2 acres or more, and instead give a tax deduction for anyone who has a tree on their property of a certain size. And in the surveys, give a tax credit for the value of the trees that they plant if they last more than 2 years. This way, it's in saying this, the city is putting their money where their mouth is. This way, you are not guilty of eroding more of our freedoms that our soldiers died so many of them to preserve.
Thank you, sir. Did you have a specific question that you wanted to pose to staff?
So you say, okay, Because I've seen people object to a tree coming down, but it's not theirs. Nobody's showing to clean up. And this little lady, she's scared of being. And she's had the house for years. She heads to the other side of the house. What is your answer? Perfectly good tree, no apparent. And a lot of these trees that have no apparent look that they're rotten. None at all. And I've had more than one. Remember one, all there was a little hole like this. And when I found it, I suggested the tree should come down, rightly so. When we finally got it over, it would have made a 20-foot pipe. Completely hollow inside, but perfectly green. So you go in and you say, the tree's fine, we really don't want you taking it down. Who's responsible for it if it does come down? Who's responsible since the person that owns the home wants to take it down? Is the city going to arrange for their leaves to be raked up every year? I know somebody mentioned walnuts. Walnuts are great on somebody else's yard as long as 2 or 3 yards away. But if you have a neighbor with a walnut tree, borderline,
very long in the tooth.
you better wear a hard hat at a certain time of the year. I've seen walnuts so bad on the ground you couldn't put your foot.
You're muted, Rick. Can you take him off mute so people at home can hear him?
Okay. Steven's on the job. Okay, Councillor Martin, can you hear me?
And now, thanks.
Okay, thank you. As I was saying, those are very good questions. I think that that's part of why we are looking or considering the arborist report in this process to help us so that it isn't the city saying that tree needs to come down. It's someone who knows trees and would be able to justify it. This is a balance that we're exploring. And the idea is not that the city would take accountability or for the leaves or that, but to have a landowner be able to have a process by which they could legitimately remove a tree, and should it come down, the obligation under the bylaw would be to replace it with a tree or a number of trees, depending on how the bylaw is written. So I think Laura said it earlier, this isn't about preventing tree removal necessarily. This is just making sure that when that does happen, it's being done in a way that's safe and for good and noble reasons, perhaps. But that there is a replacement program in place that would help us retain the benefit or re-obtain the benefit of those trees.
Knowing the percentages that I've given you of the carbon and all that sort of stuff, isn't this an infringement on the only little kingdom that each of us get to have is our little piece of property? I mean, where we get to have what we want. Like, so if I get a house and I got a tree on there, but I want a nice garden, one that may be full of flowers that like all kinds of sun. But then this healthy tree that's sitting there, or you got a walnut tree that's shedding stuff all over it, including staining the deck and everything else, and driving the neighbors nuts with the sign of walnuts running off his tin roof of his shed, like a cannon going off.
You're not wrong. You're definitely not wrong that there are issues like that. There are many ways in which municipal governments, provincial governments, federal governments require permits for people to make changes within their space, whether it's adding a bathroom or adding a swimming pool or building a fence or a shed. So
But those permits are generally making sure that people's not wiring in their house with extension cords.
sure, there's lots of reasons for it. It's about there, and the permits are done for many reasons. That's why we are responding to pressure from tree loss and coming at it with a process by which we're hoping our community can not lose trees that are very important in the long run. So there's a balance there. I agree, and it is something that not everybody will agree with. There's no way that everybody's going to agree with this. Nobody. Same with a building permit or a plumbing permit.
I'm not a tree killer. Okay, I've gone in various times and told the person it doesn't need to be done because the neighbor next door has been pressuring. Okay, so I'm not a tree killer. In fact, I had one lady, she called me up each year just for having me say her tree was okay. Didn't make a dime out of it, but I had to go to her house every year to just reassure her. So that's not the case. The case is what concerns me is preserving our freedom, each individual freedom, at least in his own property. That's the thing that bothers me the most.
And that's the balance. I think that this process is going to try and provide everybody with a process by which they can accomplish what they want to accomplish, but within, the guidelines established by the city. I think that's what Laura articulated right from the get-go. This isn't about saying no, this is about saying how and having a process to manage it.
Thank you. Thanks for your feedback, sir. Is there anybody else in council chambers who has not spoken yet? In the back, far back? And then I'll come to you.
Thanks everyone for being here tonight. So I'd just like to start by saying that in general, I am in favor of enhancing the tree bylaw because of course it is absolutely important to protect our city's trees. However, I do have one concern that was actually mentioned in the presentation, which was very well put together, by the way, so thank you for that. One of the concerns in the presentation that I guess came from citizens was that this bylaw might prevent the removal of diseased and dying trees. And I believe the response was that these trees would be exempt from the bylaw, provided there's an arborist report submitted to the city within the appropriate timeframe. And I think I'm echoing what one of the other attendees here tonight mentioned was that the costs of that arborist permit is unnecessary and just might be too much for a homeowner. If there is a tree that is, diseased, dying, it could pose a real threat to person and property. And it should be easy. It should be as easy as possible to avoid those damages. So we should make it an easier process to remove those diseased and dying trees. So the requirement for an arborist permit or an arborist report, I think the presentation also mentioned that a report could be, $250. And again, I'd like to protect our city's trees, but the cost shouldn't be onto the homeowner when there's a real valid reason to get rid of those trees. Now, I don't have an ideal solution, and it's not necessarily going to be an easy problem to solve, but I wonder if the city has thought about ways to make it easier to remove diseased, dying trees. Again, this is just a brainstorming idea. I wonder if the city would employ arborists or maybe the forestry department, and then residents could reach out to the city and have one of those arborists come check on the tree and let them know, yes, this is diseased and dying and you're allowed to remove it, before the removal happens. I know the bylaw mentioned having a arborist report brought to the city after removal, but again, residents might be okay with waiting for an appointment and having someone visit their home if it saves them paying for an arborist report. Again, not necessarily a perfect solution, but I just think it should be as easy as possible to get rid of potentially damaging trees.
So just, hi, Patra again. Yeah, so what's set in the presentation, of course, it's not set in stone. The arborist report is something that we found was consistent across other municipalities. So that's something that we're looking at. The mechanism by which we get that arborist report, it's still something we're investigating. We've been finding out from other cities if they have internal staff who can provide that service. Of course, if we go that route, it opens up issues of capacity within our forestry department if there's many different properties they have to manage in addition to the public properties. So that's all being weighed right now. I don't know if Rick wants to respond on that point, but it is something that we're looking at to find out the best way to get that arborist report and making it as easy as possible for the residents. So thank you for your feedback.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think there was another gentleman in the back.
Thank you. This is a planning question for staff. Just wondering if the woodlots in the expansion lands that aren't on environmentally sensitive lands are planned to be protected for parkland, or is it possible that some of those woodlots could be removed? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Without getting into too many details of which woodlot you might be speaking of, because there are quite a few, through the official plan, the city's official document, there is a lot of protected area where these woodlots exist today. Those are generally protected from any development to occur. There would be woodlots outside of that, and that's where this bylaw would need to be updated to ensure that if trees were removed from part of that woodlot, what would the process be to get something planted back, or would they just generally be protected? Through the existing woodlot bylaw that we have today, there are some woodlots protected under it. But again, we're looking to update this as a tool to protect those other trees that aren't protected under the official plan.
Thank you very much. And just one other question. What is the definition of sensitive lands that the city's working with? Like the presentation talked about environmentally sensitive lands.
So those are lands that have current environmental protections that are legislated. I don't have a description of what that entails, but I can find that and put that on our Let's Talk page.
So that would be like Ministry of Natural Resources.
Yes,
Okay, thank
I
you.
think among others as well, but definitely that one.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, sir. I don't see any raised hands on for any of our virtual attendees. Is there anybody else in council chambers that wants to provide a comment or ask a question? Anybody else who hasn't spoken yet? Okay.
Just a comment to what was said, that it'd be ideal if you're gonna have to insist on a certified arborist to do the examination, it should be it should be a city employee paid by the taxpayers. So it doesn't cost the homeowner a thing. That way you're not favoring any particular tree service. And with it coming from as a free thing, it's not a burden to the homeowner.
Okay, thank you, sir. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much for attending, both those who've come in person as well as those attending online. We know there's lots of other things you could be doing tonight, and we really are sincere when we say how vital it is to hear from our community when we're thinking about decisions that are obviously going to impact you, and so that we can provide council with as much information as possible that reflects the community's thoughts and feelings about these important issues. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'll turn it over to Laura if she has any closing comments.
Just as that's being brought back up, I want to thank you all for your questions and your comments and your feedback. A draft of this bylaw is still being developed. The different options are still being looked into to inform what would be a final draft that we would bring to council for consideration. This town hall is a crucially important part of our bylaw development process. So thank you all again for participating. But before we adjourn, I would like I want to notify everyone watching this town hall that you could still share any questions or feedback regarding our bylaw development process. There are several options to do so. Whoops, sorry about that. Oh, there we go. Okay. So if you go to Let's Talk at Brantford.ca -trees, you can share feedback there. You can also call the customer contact line at 519-759-4150 or email customercontact@Brantford.ca, and you will be directed to a member of the project team, depending on kind of what your question covers. And this meeting is being recorded live on YouTube. It will be available to watch again if you visit youtube.com/City of Brantford. So just on behalf of everybody here today from the city, thank you for participating in this town hall and for watching online. This town hall is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody.